Hello, my fellow Infodemic unicorns. This is Terri Senft, and I am here to talk to you about a project that I have been working on that has turned into a policy brief that is about young people and the infodemic. I'm starting off by explaining it that way because this is going to probably go New York style fast, and I don't want anyone to panic thinking that I've glossed over something that they could really use. There will be links provided so you can access the policy document, and these slides will be available. And of course, I always encourage you to do what I do in these situations as I watch videos, which is to screenshot anything that I find really interesting so I can mull it over later. So to keep things concentrated, I thought it would be useful to sort of go through the steps of this talk so you know where we are, so there's a bit of a roadmap. So we're going to begin by drilling into what we're talking about, which is, of course, the infodemic. And then we're going to be talking about who we're focused on in this talk, which are young people. Then we're going to cover what young people are talking about amongst themselves, what their concerns are at a global level. Then we're going to move into the unique ways that young people use social media. These are different at a platform level and a practice level than a lot of older users, so it's worth knowing. Then the fifth element will be a discussion of what we all want to know, which is how young people are negotiating misinformation online. Then we're going to touch briefly on the question of what needs more understanding. And here I'm going to sort of lay out four different frameworks for thinking about issues that are connected to things like algorithmic circulation of emotion online and the generation of what I've been thinking about as shame cycles online and ways to intervene at the practitioner level with assessing individual perceptions of risk while managing social media environments. We won't be able to get too deep into that. There's plenty in the policy document, but I do want to touch on it for you. And then we will move into the all-important what are we supposed to do, which would be policy type recommendations, but also recommendations for communication practices, and then some best practice examples, because nothing beats seeing a tactic deployed on the ground. So in this first section, I want to just briefly skim, because I assume we've already had a lot of this material by the time you get to my stuff. This concept of infodemic, definitions, talking about variants of misinformation, disinformation, etc., and talking about agents. So we know our definition of infodemic is the excess amount of information about a problem or an issue, which makes it difficult to identify a solution, and especially with health-related solutions. And we're told by UNICEF and others that in an infodemic, false claims circulate more easily, hampering public health responses, creating confusion, distrust, and causing harm to people's lives. We also know that infodemics aren't limited to social media. All of our colleagues who have been working on the ground in places that don't have large connectivity tell us that. But they often originate and spread that way. So I'm going to show you two different documents that I don't have time to go into here, but I have provided a link for you in case you are interested in hearing sort of a lecture I give undergraduates. I'm assuming you know much of this. These are what we would call the disordered genres of the information ecosphere, with disinformation, misinformation, hyperpartisan, fake news, rumors, etc. And then the next slide focuses on what we would call agents of the process. So again, if anybody's interested, there is a lecture that you are welcome to grab and show students or what have you. We're going to move on to our real topic today, which is the subjects, the young people. So when we're talking about young people, who exactly are we talking about? Well, as you can see from my little circles here, uh, we've got a few ways that this breaks down. Policymakers think about this category differently than industry people do. Industry people matter because they do a lot of the fine grain research on this demographic. Uh, the legal world and the platform regulation world thinks even differently still. And then if you ask young people themselves, they don't identify, solely through their age. They have other kinds of considerations. So we're going to touch very quickly on each of them, and you are always welcome to take a look at these slides at your leisure. So the first, I'm going to move my head. The first illustration I've made for you is to make a distinction between policy definitions of young people and industry definitions of young people. And as you can see, there's no universally agreed upon definitions for policymakers. Why does this matter for us? Because when we're trying to get fine-grained research on habits, we'll often see, people 33 and younger. That's an enormous swath. Even the WHO, they label young people as ages 10 to 24. And in terms of developmental issues, in terms of legal issues, in terms of platform use, in terms of consumer patterns, that is a massive group to lump into one category. Industry tends to organize things by what they call generations. You've probably heard the term Generation X or Generation Z. So young people fit into this category that they call Generation Z. Sometimes you see something called Generation Alpha. It might be worth noting when you look through materials. Now we're going to move on to a discussion of the difference, how young people are defined differently by the folks who own digital platforms and folks who make laws. So you can see here, let's look at platform regulation because that's more straightforward. In general, on most platforms, the age for, quote, non-kids platform entry is 13. All right. The age for entry into platforms that have sexually explicit content is 18. And there's also something important and worth noting that is called platform screening. And that's stuff that's done at the algorithmic level to make sure advertising for products that would normally be sold to 21-year-olds doesn't appear on their feeds. It's generally done at the advertisers' request because they don't want to pay for an audience they can't reach. But it might be something to think about in terms of protecting young people from certain kinds of inflammatory or grooming type content in the future. If we go to the legal side of this picture, we see that there are a number of different categories. We've got an idea called protected age, which is the age that you can be treated by the criminal justice system. This matters if we're talking about measures to punish, for instance, people for creating or spreading disinformation. Which is increasingly an issue. There's teenage troll farms, for instance, being paid to circulate disinformation. Then we have something called a statutory age. That is the age of consent. It could be the age for sexual consent, could be the age for consent to medical procedures such as immunization. It could also be construed as the age of consent for research purposes. So that is something to keep in mind, and of course it varies by country. Then we have something called the age of majority, and that would be what defines the difference between a minor and a non-minor. And that's generally associated with voting age, and it varies country to country again. The age of majority differs from what we would think of as purchasing age, which usually covers things like alcohol or tobacco or any kind of substance that would be deemed to have long-term health damaging effects on a population. Again, this is something to keep in mind when we consider the knock-on effects of incendiary algorithmic patterns or language that might lead toward things like extremist grooming. Now, when you talk to young people themselves, they tend to speak about their age, not necessarily by number, although they like to say the youth a lot, but in terms of concepts like intersectionality and taste. Intersectionality, you've probably heard, refers to the overlapping and at times competing features of identity that we all negotiate. If I could be young and HIV positive and black and with 2 children, and I'll have a different identity than somebody who is also lumped into the young people category but has other salient characteristics. Taste performance refers to identifying by way of what we find funny or interesting or inspiring or cool or what have you online. This is a very important factor for algorithmic sorting because algorithmic sorting is driven by a need to give marketers data and data about purchasing trends. So people find themselves pooled into communities sometimes by accident as a result of those kinds of choices, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. So now that we've talked about who young people are for different stakeholders, let's talk about what they're thinking about. I obviously have to preface this by saying when we speak in these global terms, we lose so much fine-grained material. So take this for what it's worth and also understand that a lot of the collecting of the data that we have about what young people feel, the global data gets collected by sources like Facebook, which a lot of young people don't use, or they are national or regional, so extrapolating them out can sometimes be a little iffy. But we're going to focus on 4 different categories. First of all, their sort of position vis-a-vis COVID-19. We're going to talk about their chief worries right now. We're going to talk about their trust or lack of in institutions, including press and platforms. And then we're going to talk about their propensity for narratives that involve things like truth or authority or believability over arguments that would be constructed by old-fashioned notions of logic and evidence. So this is a bit of a chart, and you are free to look at it at your leisure, but let's just hit a couple of key distinctions. We know that this is a very large demographic, making up 30% of the global population, and 40% of the population is under 24. We know that the infection rates are rising among this group, but the perception of what we might call health exceptionalism is staying the same. Young people were told early on that they were not at high risk for contracting the virus and were sent to work and to school under that understanding. And now they sort of are trying to negotiate the reality of the situation and the fact that they are economically in situations where they come into contact with large amounts of people, which makes them potential super spreaders. We have a reported low level of trust among this group in public institutions, in private corporations, social media platforms, and news online. Young people historically have low levels of trust. This is above and beyond that. We have a value for, if you look at entertainment preferences, we have values for narratives that emphasize emotional authenticity of felt experience and a lower interest in arguments that are driven by evidence. If you can see under values and then significant because, we have that's important because debunking strategies often rely on an openness to argument. But rumor and stigma and conspiracy theories, which are the major formats of misinformation right now, tend to turn on feeling-centered narratives. right? So it's the communicative preferences are tied into the problem here. With regard to risk, in addition to risk for COVID itself, we also know that this group has historically been at high risk for profiling, targeting, and grooming by political extremists. We know, in particular, those extremists, particularly extremists on the alt-right side of the political spectrum, have a long and documented history on young people's gaming platforms. So the next slides I'm going to go through pretty quickly. They are for my data-driven friends. So here we have one discussing how money and education concerns are dominating the mental landscape of young people. The next slide I have for you has to do with the way mental health concerns are dominating. In this particular bracket, they are huge. And it's worth noting here that in this study of young Australians, many reported that they don't seek mental health assistance because they feel it's not as important as everything else going on. When you have a situation where people have needs to express, but feel ashamed to do so, that can turn into problematic dynamics over social media, and we will get to those. We also have a pretty documented rise in domestic conflicts and violence across the world. This is from a UNICEF study of Central America, but you see it everywhere. And we have a very sharp uptick in this group of interest in conspiracy beliefs. You can see this is from the UK, and every single one of these COVID conspiracies studied. The 16 to 24 demographic had the highest numbers of belief. In Australia, there's very strong evidence that maps that to not just being in this age demographic, but also being white and male. So the increasing radicalization of young men around the world, in part through conspiracy narratives that, like, for instance, the QAnon, that's a bit of a hydra, and COVID becomes part of an overarching story. That is something that we need to be keeping in mind as we go through this talk. So now that we've been talking about what's on the mind of young people, we're going to move on to discussion of how they are using social media in ways that differentiate them from their older counterparts online. So I'm going to be talking a little bit about preferred platforms, a little bit about preferred communication styles, a bit about their perceptions of the advantages and risks of being on social media itself, because of course that feeds into your practices, and then a bit about their preferred interaction patterns online. So again, we've got a big chart, and I'm going to gloss over it, and you are most welcome to look at it at your leisure. There will be some examples of each one of these things as we go on. So with regard to platforms, overall, younger people tend to prefer platforms that prioritize collaborative entertainment over deliberative discourse. So for instance, TikTok and gaming platforms rather than Twitter. Okay, this is important because on these particular platforms, it becomes hard to source information, in part because of the way the technologies work, and I'll get to that in a moment. With regard to young people's practices using social media, we know that they have heavy reliance on images over text, and we know that they are relatively comfortable with what we would call meme culture, which I'll get into in a moment, where alterations and appropriations of images are actually culturally okay, as long as intended meaning is understood by what they perceive to be the right parties. And that is important because memes are especially subject to greater ambiguity, particularly with regard to COVID-19, where many memes that began as rumors, as parodies, actually then became circulated as legitimate information. With regard to protocols, we know that young people have a higher than average awareness of things like algorithmic processes and trends and feeds and monetizations and whatnot. But I want to underscore the fact that because you are fluent in the language of algorithms, it doesn't necessarily mean you are literate in the language of algorithms. So there might be an overstatement of young people when they say they can game the algorithm. Let's move to procedures. So with regard to procedures, we have a greater reliance on social media for employment and education purposes. This starts to lead to highly curated procedures presenting the best self online and lower tolerance for conflict outside of anonymous encounters. So I will show you a couple of examples of that. Do not panic. I got you. And then finally, for preferences, there are preferences for online engagements. They tend to be assessed using risk management procedures that combine a sort of awareness with platform protocols, like the way algorithms circulate stuff, with a sort of sensitivity to social stigma via what I would call weaponized drama. So drama becomes a bit of a catchphrase when you're talking to young people, and when you hear it, it should be a red flag for you. So I've broken this chart into some data-driven material for you, and again, we're going through this fast, but there's plenty of time to look at it on your own. So now we're going to talk about how young people are consuming, what kind of platforms and what kind of technologies they're gravitating toward. So when it comes to the numbers, we know that everybody has seen a rise in social media use during COVID-19. Makes sense. But the highest use is among 16 to 24-year-olds. Most importantly, though, the way that they prefer to take in social media differs. So this is a handy chart from Visual Capitalist that sort of tells us the brain of a Gen Z. And we see that there's a huge preference for online videos, streaming TV, and video gaming, with 50% jumps in those alone during COVID-19. For those of us who are not in Gen Z and like to see what our boomer brains look like, you can feel free to take a look at this chart on your own. Look at our different brains. Where young people consume their media online also differs. So the top platforms for all ages, and you know this because you've probably been directed there, are Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp. This is different when we talk about young people. For that demographic, the top apps are Snapchat, TikTok, Discord, and Instagram. So you can see if you have a robust, presence targeting young people on Twitter, maybe they're not going to hear you. The same goes for news. The top sources for global news consumption are Facebook, YouTube, and WhatsApp. But again, look at what happens when we talk about young people. Here, we've got the top sources being YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok. So again, these are radically different platforms for receiving news, and more to the point, they're different modalities of receiving news. So what do I mean by that? Well, first, apparently I'm not going there yet. We're going to talk about what young people think about news and social media in general. So this was an Axios survey, and we see here that 83% of young people, at least in the US, are saying they're getting their news through social media. But interestingly, 93% say that social media is untrustworthy. So you see the problem we're dealing with here? If we look at exposure and confidence, we see this this claim to intentionally like or share content to train algorithms at 46%, almost half the young population of the U.S. reporting. And we've got this confidence level that they can spot misinformation at 69%. But is that true? Is your confidence level the same as your actual ability? Well, to figure this out, now let's go into how young people communicate. So the first thing you need to know on these platforms is what matters. Sharing images and video matters. Memes matter. So I made this little illustration to show you what I would call photo meme logic. There's other kinds of memes, but in photo meme logic, we have first a stock photo. I think we've all seen this one. Second, we have an alteration being done to text that's on a photo. Third, we have alterations to text and images. And then finally, we have alterations to text and images that reference other memes. So if you're in stage 4 of a meme, you're intentionally circulating it as a way to signal to an in-group. And you're not like hashtagging, this is what you're supposed to do, right? You're having conversations with like-minded folks, taste-based conversations that have a bit of what they call security through obscurity. If you don't know the code, you don't know how to crack it. This matters when we're talking about memes, this facility and this eagerness to alter things. It matters a lot when we get into memes that circulate around COVID and shame, which we will get to shortly. Another thing that makes it very difficult to track content on the newer platforms that we're seeing are the creation of mechanisms for co-creation. So this would be a little instructional on how you can do a duet in TikTok with somebody else. So if somebody is citing an image that came from a split screen duet, it's hard to figure out who to cite as the source of the original content. Another thing that matters a lot with young people is gaming. It matters a lot in the social media ecosphere in general, but for young people especially, social gaming is on the rise. The breakout game this year was called Among Us. Interestingly, it was an older game that was brought back into vogue because it had a highly social element to it, and it could be played via streaming platforms, which I'll talk about in a moment. You might have heard of different politicians jumping on Among Us in order to sort of court youth vote favor. AOC did it in the States. One of the interesting features of this generation's social media use is not just gaming or social gaming, but the social aspect of watching other people socially game. It has a little bit of an Inception feel to it, but it is popular because the people who do that sort of thing well on camera are able to kind of function as influencers and entertainers, and they draw communities around themselves. The leading platform for this is Twitch. There are some side platforms that are on the rise in other countries as well. When you're talking about something like game streaming, you're talking about embedded content. Why? Because you've got somebody playing a game, you've got a camera looking at somebody like me, right? And then let me see if I can show it to you. Okay, so if you look at the middle column on this slide, you will see that there is right here where I'm marking, there is somebody playing with the camera on their face as they play a game which is live streamed over TikTok with links to another streaming platform it's gone now, but it's called Mixter. So you can see there's a lot of Russian doll nesting within nesting of content, and young people expect this, they enjoy it, and that's their communicative pattern. Of course, young people don't just interact with the technologies on their platforms, they do interact with one another. Here, I want to talk about how. The first thing to realize is that there have been some significant changes in networking behaviors in the last decade. And the upshot of that has been that younger people, far more than my generation, have been sort of groomed to understand that their presence online needs to always be understood as a semi-professional presence because anyone can Google you. The upshot of that is that you have some traits that are associated with work-oriented social networking, and you can see this at the top bubble. We've got the idea of the self as a performer, the self as a branded good in hiring marketplaces, a personal reputation focus, seeking safety, risk aversion behavior. And then we've got traits associated with consumer-oriented social networking, because that's another thing that young people do. They turn increasingly to social media, and particularly with young women, to influencers on social media as ways to assess information for purchasing. And that practice bleeds over into information for health and for other kinds of uses. So traits associated with consumer-oriented social networking include the notion of the self as an audience member, the notion of the self as a customer who votes with dollars, the notion of a brand reputation, the idea of esteem seeking, and of course, aspirational behavior. Having said all that, I don't want anyone to come away with the idea that young people aren't turning to online sources for the same things that others do. They do rely on social media exchanges for support, for political solidarity, and for learning how to mobilize and become activists, and we need to never lose sight of that. So in between this need to perform a sort of professional branded persona and a desire for community and solidarity sits a discussion of what young people like to call drama. So drama is something that needs to get further drilled down on in the research, but it can be roughly defined as a negative association with losing face in online interactions. The last thing I want to say about this particular section is that we don't want to write off young people as only looking for entertainment and only concerned about their image and only risk averse. We also, the data shows us that, yes, entertainment matters, yes. And in many ways, it's sort of a refuge from perceptions of drama and demands to always be your best self. But education also matters. It is something that you see again and again raised by young people in studies. So now we're going to move on to the meat and potatoes here and ask how young people handle misinformation online. And again, this is going to vary wildly from region to region, and you always need to drill down further when you do this kind of work, but here are some global observations. So let's start with the positives. On the one hand, young people have more experience online. They have a general distrust of social media, which means they're not as easily sucked in. They report higher confidence levels in spotting misinformation, although, as I said, we're not quite sure if that's true. It's been tested with regard to text, like clickbait, but not with image-based material. They are, however, more apt to use image checking tools like deny and reverse image searches. They are more apt to call out manipulated information. They have a greater awareness of platform algorithms, as we've discussed, and globally they have higher formal education levels, which can be very helpful. On the downside, we do have a situation where entertainment seeking dominates time online. So any information given needs to compete with that format. We have a population who do receive the majority of their news via social media, and that doesn't seem like it's going to change anytime soon. We have perhaps, as I said, confidence in spotting misinformation overestimated. We have a population that has a propensity for being more, if not more fooled, more driven by outraged reactions, and that links to what I'll later talk about in terms of the influence ecosphere, driven by emotions on the move. We have a population that likes platforms that make it hard to determine where images originate and doesn't always like to use things like hashtags. We have a population that is highly sensitized to social risk aversion and conflict avoidance, the drama situation. We have a population that is more apt to be drawn into social shame cycles, which I'll talk about shortly, fueled by platform algorithms. And we know, again, that we have a population that is more heavily targeted for ideological